Welcome to Fuzzybutts and Friends. Well, as much as it drives Fuzzybutts all over this place, absolutely crazy when they hear me say it. I am the host of this show, your big dog, Luke Robinson. And we have back with us this week. We're so fortunate to have back with us Ginger Morgan. She's the executive director of the Puppy Up Foundation, and she's also the co-host and co-producer of Fuzzybutts and Friends. Ginger, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, good. We just did our cooking episode for Fuzzy Butts and Friends this week. It was a crazy experience. I'm excited. I think we're going to drop that soon. So,
It was
everybody,
crazy,
yeah, it
definitely
was.
crazy. But the kids liked the soup we made or the stew we made.
Yeah, yes, it was fun for everybody. But we're back to business now. And speaking about being back, Ginger, we have a guest that we've spoken to earlier on season 2 here of Fuzzy Butts and Friends. Is Dr. Kristen Weishaar, and she's the director of clinical trials for the Flint Animal Cancer Center at Colorado State University. Dr. Weishaar, how are you? Welcome back.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'm doing well. I'm really glad to be here, and I appreciate you guys taking the time to chat with me today.
Well, we loved when we had you on last time because you're replete with data sets. You have a ton of information. I'm a data guy, and so I nerd out. That's why Phil Bergman and I we're always nerding out on data. What do we know and stuff. And so we wanted, I guess, to use our previous discussion as a platform to talk about your particular area of interest and area of focus, and that is clinical trials. So I know I sent you some talking points, and let's just start out first of all and talk about the clinical trials there that you do. Just talk about your job there at Colorado State University. Let's start there.
Sure, absolutely. So let's first start with what are clinical trials, because that's an important topic. So a clinical trial is a research project that's done in the clinic with us. It's with dogs or cats that have been diagnosed with cancer. So these are animals with spontaneous disease. These are not lab animals. These are client-owned animals. They have pet parents that they go home with every day. They don't live in a lab. Their environments aren't controlled. And they have spontaneous diseases, which makes them a much better model for testing drugs or devices or whatever it is that we're doing, because it's going to be more like the real life situation. So you think about if you're testing a drug or some sort of new device in a mouse in a lab, for cancer specifically, in order to induce cancer in a mouse, you have to suppress their immune system. They have to be specific breeds of mice, and they're all going to be very similar to one another. And so if you test a drug in that setting and it works really well, that may not necessarily translate into the clinic. But if you think about using client-owned pets that have spontaneous diseases, intact immune systems, they're going to be better models for disease and for actual response to treatment. So if we see a benefit in these animals, it's more likely going to translate to being actually able to be used in a wider population of animals. And again, these are different breeds, different sizes, different ages, different genetic makeups. And so it's just going to translate a lot better to the real world. And that can also potentially translate to humans as well. So we think about, our pets are living in the same environment as us. They get the same diseases as us. And so if we find a treatment or a device that can be used in a pet, that can potentially translate to being used in people as well. And so my job specifically at the Animal Cancer Center, I'm the director of oncology clinical trials, and that sort of has two facets to it. So one side is helping to orchestrate all of the clinical trials that go on in the cancer center. So I work with the investigators, so the people running the trials that are doing the research, and help them sort of get their clinical trials set up on the back end. I'll meet with them sort of when they're in the process of developing their studies, figuring out what the best way to conduct the studies is, the best patient population, figuring out the budget, how much it's going to cost to be able to do all of these studies. And then, once they get their funding approved, and help them to set up a capture form, so where we can actually collect the data for the study, help out with advertising, so getting all the studies on websites and out to the local community so they're aware of the studies. And then once the studies are actually in process, so once we start enrolling patients, that's where sort of the other half of my job comes in, which is on the clinic side. So I oversee the clinical operations of our clinical trials service in the oncology program. And so we have a really well-developed clinical trials program in oncology. We're very lucky. We have 2 specific clinical trials technicians who are responsible for all the patient care related to patients that are enrolled in clinical trials, a clinical trials coordinator who's responsible for making sure we're following all the study protocols, collecting all the samples that we need and processing them appropriately, and just sort of keeping an eye on everything that's going on. And then we also have a clinical trials intern who's somebody, it's a 1-year position, somebody that is interested in pursuing an oncology residency at some point and is sort of in the transition phase on their way to that. So we have a really well-established service, and we have pets that are enrolled in clinical trials come in specifically through our service. And so we manage their care, collect all the samples we need for the study, collect all the data, and are also working on recruitment as well is another big thing, obviously. So talking to clients whose pets have been diagnosed with cancer about the clinical trials options and seeing if that's the best fit for them and their pet. And so I sort of, am in charge of all of those things and overseeing all that, making sure everything's going smoothly and that we're following all of our protocols and collecting all the data that we need.
That's a lot. That's why I have to take notes while you're talking. When I put on the talking points about the metrics, that's basically just the numbers. So how many current trials does the CSU currently have? Oncology trials do you guys have going on right now?
Sure. So on average, we have between 15 and 25 clinical trials going on at one time. They vary a little bit in complexity. Some of them are just short sample collection studies that may last a day or a week. And then others that are more treatment-based studies may continue on for weeks to months, depending on how the pets do in the study. So, and varying levels of sample collection and visits and rechecks that are required. So can vary a bit. We usually, on average, have a total of about 30 different clinical trials going on throughout a single year. So, they'll come and go throughout the year. Some are sort of quick, where they can be wrapped up within a couple of months, and others, can take years to complete. So they'll vary a little bit. We're a very busy service. So like I mentioned, we have patients that come in specifically through clinical trials. So last year, I believe we saw about 750 appointments through clinical trials, which was about 170-ish patients, and enrolled about 110 pets into a clinical trial.
So I'm sorry, say that number again. What was that? 110? You kind of cut out there. 110.
Yes, I'm sorry. So we saw about 750-ish appointments. We saw about 170 patients, and then we enrolled about 110 pets into clinical trials.
Was that for last year, 2022?
Last year, yeah, 2021. Sorry, 2022. I don't know what year.
That's all right. Okay, so well, as you and I know, signing up puppy dogs and enrollees in clinical trials, not an easy thing. I'm sure you know Puppy Up Foundation. We funded clinical trials before. I don't think, Ginger, we've not done a CSU study, which is odd because Steve Withrow was a hero of mine, and because we have the Murphy connection there. But
hero of all of ours, let's be honest.
What's that?
He's a hero of all of ours, let's be honest.
Indeed. Absolutely. Well, I call him one of the godfathers. He and McEwen, the godfathers of veterinary oncology. And he really brought the comparative side to it with his background. So, and I met him and talked to him on many occasions. And he's just genuinely a decent person and represents well for the entire community. So, yeah. There's a little bit of delay in the feed, Ginger. Are you seeing that? So if you're watching this on our YouTube channel, fuzzybuttsstudios.com, Ginger, are you seeing that delay? Is the audio okay on your end?
I see the delay, but the audio is fine.
Okay. All right.
I see the delay myself as well. I apologize for that. I don't know what the...
No worries. Your audio is still coming in strong. So let's go ahead and press ahead. So Dr. Weishaar, what percentage of those clinical trials or therapies? Do you do diagnostics, clinical trials, maybe medical devices? Do you know that breakdown?
I don't have specific numbers, but the majority of the studies that we do are treatment based, whether that's looking at a novel drug that has not been used in pets with cancer before, or it's a drug that's already available that we're looking at using in a different way or in combination with other therapies. We'll have imaging studies. So we'll work with our radiology department and our radiologists to look at different types of imagings for pets with cancer. And then also working with our surgeons. Sometimes there's surgical studies that they're doing, looking at different types of procedures. Some of the limb spares and osteosarcomas is a big thing we've done studies with in the past. And also different devices as well from outside companies or internally. So majority therapy based, but definitely a wide variety of studies that we'll have.
Okay. Let's see. I guess what percentage of those, when you say therapies, are like chemotherapy versus radiation? Do you have that breakdown, the various types of treatment modalities?
So the majority of them are going to be drug therapy, some sort of drug, whether it's a chemotherapy or an immunotherapy. We'll see. We have a couple studies with radiation, and it'll vary a little bit again, depending on, like I said, the types of trials that we have are changing all the time. And so I would say probably at any given time, 70 to 75% of our trials are going to be treatment or drug based, and then the other 25% will be either radiation therapy or surgery or imaging or a device or something like that. Rough estimates.
Okay, and I have one of my bullet points, the importance of N, the value of N, N being the population size of a study. Mm-hmm. And the N is it's such an important concept metaphor for me, because I always talk about the value, and the value of an N of one is that every cancer dog, every patient is a data point, in addition to the fact that it's a beautiful human being. It's a beautiful being. It's a soul. It's a spirit. But additional to that, it's that every cancer patient has valuable data to put into the corpus of knowledge. But as you know, and we found out as a foundation in the world of veterinary oncology and comparative oncology, is that it really is very difficult to get a large population, a large N for each clinical trial. Do you have an idea of what the average size is? How many patients there are per trial?
So, and it's a really great question, a really important point to bring up. And really, it's going to vary quite a bit depending on what the goal of the clinical trial is. So some of these really early phase studies where we're just testing a drug in a dog, let's say, for the first time, where we're trying to find out what toxicity we might see, what the appropriate dose and schedule is, those are going to be small studies by nature, just because we don't need them to be big studies. Usually those might have somewhere between 15 and 18 patients that are enrolled. And the reason that they're small is, first of all, we're taking groups of dogs, so usually about 3 dogs, starting them at a low dose of the drug. And if those dogs tolerate the drug well, then we're going to increase the dose until we get to the point where we sort of find that sweet spot of what the dose is that is hopefully going to have a benefit and is not going to have significant toxicity. And because we are starting at low doses, the chances of benefit for these pets is pretty low. And so we don't want to have to enroll a bunch of dogs into the study knowing that the treatment's not going to be very beneficial, right? So those are inherently small studies by design. Whereas once we're getting to, the more advanced studies where we're actually trying to prove how efficacious the drug is, and maybe potentially even trying to get it FDA approved so it's available on the market, those are going to be much larger studies. So we're looking at, 150, 200 patients that are enrolled. And on the human side, it's even bigger than that. It's usually thousands of patients that are enrolled. And so oftentimes, if that's a study that we're trying to do where we really need that large number of patients and we're trying to do it in a timely manner, there will often involve multiple sites. So other collaborators, whether that's other academic institutions or private practices that have experience with clinical trials, working together with those groups to be able to accomplish the goals of the study and complete our enrollment much faster. And that's a really great way to work with those other institutions towards a common goal.
Yeah, but as you know, when I had Murphy there at CSU, he had was first he was DX with nasal adenocarcinoma. We did not IMR, yeah, IMRT first of all over a few weeks, and then not only did it not arrest the growth of the initial tumor, we had a secondary sarcoma in his nasopharynx. And so we did an aggressive form of 3-day radiation, SRT, I believe, I'm fairly certain. And then after that, the question was, do we want to do any follow-on treatment? And, you know, Dr. Withrow and I discussed that at length. And he found a study in Australia that looked at chemo after pretty much after what we did. I don't know if it was specifically after 2 rounds of radiation. It could have been just 1, but the population of that study was only 8 dogs. And my question to him, and we talked about this, is, well, what really of medically significance and relevance can we really truly glean from that small? So, so size does matter, but you raise a wonderful, a very valid salient point earlier about that there are the different phases of clinical trials in the discovery and development of drug treatments and diagnostics. So what you were saying earlier is that when you're in the initial phase 1, say phase 2, I think phase 1 is only in the lab. I think I'm not sure.
Phase 1 is dose finding, dose toxicity. So the type of study I was talking about, where small numbers of dogs that get, or whatever species, get dose escalated to find an optimal dose and look at side effects.
Yeah, please go through the phases. That's where I was getting to.
Absolutely. So clinical trials generally are, most common phases are phase 1 to 4. There are some phase 0 studies which aren't really prevalent in veterinary medicine, so I'll skip over those. But a phase 1 study is really, the goal is to look at toxicity and find an optimal dose. So generally with drugs, we're looking for what's called the maximally tolerated dose. So that is the highest dose that we can give without causing significant side effects that are going to be intolerable. So usually starting, like I said, with a small group of animals at a lower dose. And then as long as those, generally it's a three animals in a group, as long as those 3 pets tolerate the drug well, then we'll go on to our next dose. So go up a little bit, enroll 3 more dogs. If those dogs do well, keep escalating until we get to that dose that we're looking for. If we see pets that are having toxicity at certain doses, then we'll do what's called expand the cohort. So enroll potentially another 3 dogs at that same dose. So there's a total of 6 dogs that are receiving that dose, and then sort of make decisions based on the toxicity that we see in those additional three animals. So really the goals of these studies is, you know, finding an appropriate dose and schedule. You know, sometimes we don't know how often to give a drug, looking at that, and then also recording side effects. So that's another big thing, is seeing what types of side effects that we're seeing. Another thing that's often done in this study, these types of studies, is giving a dose of the medication and then collecting serial blood samples afterwards to measure drug levels in the body to sort of see what the metabolism of the drug is. And, you know, if it's a oral drug, how much of the drug actually gets into the bloodstream, and how long it takes to get to that maximum concentration in the bloodstream, how quickly it drops off. And then potentially looking, depending on the type of drug that it is, looking to see if there's actually the effects that we're looking for. So what the drug is supposed to be doing, is it actually doing that, which might be looking at immune cells in the blood, or potentially taking samples of the tumor to look for changes after the drug is given. So that's basically phase 1 studies. After a phase 1 study is completed, moving on to a phase 2 study. So this again is going to use that dose that you determined from your phase 1 study in a larger population of animals. Still very much looking at toxicity, might start to look at some efficacy as well. So sort of seeing how beneficial the drug is at doing whatever it's supposed to do, shrinking the tumor, causing changes in the blood, whatever you're looking for. And so that's going to be a larger number of animals, maybe in the 20 to 30 range, maybe a little bit more, sort of depending on what your goals are. And then once you're seeing, if you see what you're looking for in that phase 2 study, if you're seeing that the drug is tolerable and that it's providing some efficacy, then moving on to a phase 3 study. So phase 3 studies are you're really trying to look at how effective this drug is and if it's doing what you want it to do while still looking at toxicity, obviously. And oftentimes these are randomized and blinded and maybe controlled. So comparing the drug that you're looking at to a different therapy, whether that's a placebo or the treatment that's commonly used for that tumor type. And so randomized meaning pets are going to be randomly assigned to one treatment group or the other. Blinded meaning usually the owners don't know what treatment their patient is getting, and also the investigators who are actually evaluating the pet for response don't know what treatment the pet is getting, so you can sort of get an objective idea of how the patients are responding. And these are usually larger studies that involve 100 to 200 animals. These are the studies that are required in order to get FDA approval of a drug. So having a controlled randomized study to actually show the benefit of this drug. And then phase 4 studies are pretty uncommon in veterinary medicine. They're sort of post-monitoring studies after FDA approval has been given. They use them in human medicine for things like getting the drug approved for a different population. So say if you want to use it in pediatric patients or different tumor types or whatever it is. And some of those are required by the FDA. So they may say, we're going to give you approval, but we need you to do this additional study in order to maintain your approval or to get whatever additional approval you're looking for. So uncommon in veterinary medicine, more of a human medicine thing. But so those are the basic phases of clinical trials. Does that all make sense?
It does. Thank you for going through that. So I'm leading or going somewhere with all of this. So early on, the step number 1 is establishing tolerance and toxicity. So the enrollees in clinical trials there at the Flint Animal Cancer Center there at CSU, the enrollees by the patients that sign up for clinical trials there, the tolerance and toxicity levels have already been established, and so it's safe. There's not that necessarily there's only the inherent risk that is within the study, correct?
Not necessarily. We do plenty of phase 1 studies at CSU. So that is, we, like I said, it's the studies that we have are very diverse. And so we have phase 1 studies, we have phase 2 studies, we have phase 3 studies. It's a wide variety. And some of them, there can be some overlap between the phases as well. And so, that's something that we warn clients about, when they're enrolling their pet in a clinical trial, even if it is a drug that is well established, that we have doses and we know side effects. We always warn them that is one of the risks of participating in a clinical trial. First of all, that the treatment or whatever it is that we're doing may not actually benefit their pet. We can't guarantee that. And there may be side effects that we can't predict, and those could be severe. We can give you an idea of what side effects we expect based on our previous experience with the drug, but there could be unknown things that occur. And that's just, sort of how the clinical trials work. And, so it's really important, when we're talking to clients about enrolling their pets in clinical trials, to make sure they understand completely what is expected of them when they're enrolling their pet in a trial. How often they have to come in for visits, if they're going to have to be giving oral medications at home, if there's, we usually have a owner diary that we have them take home and fill out so they can record any side effects that occur so we can keep track of that. And we also want to make sure that they know what to expect from us. So, what exactly is going to happen to their pet when they're enrolled in the trial, understanding that there's a chance it may not have a benefit, understanding that there are side effects that could be severe, and making sure that they're comfortable with all that. So that's all covered in an informed consent document that we go through with owners prior to enrolling them in a study and having them sign that. And it's important to know that there are, benefits and disadvantages of enrolling a pet in a clinical trial. So benefits, getting exposure to a treatment or imaging or device that may not be available to standard populations that could have a benefit similar or even better than what we're using in the clinic as sort of our standard of care. There's often financial incentives associated with the clinical trials. So usually most of the treatments and the procedures that are included in the clinical trial are paid for by the study. There may be additional financial incentives when their pet comes off the study. So we might give them a credit to their study account, to their patient's account, to be put towards additional treatment. And then sort of the altruistic aspect of things, which is really important for our pet owners, knowing that, even if we may not help their pet, they're contributing to knowledge that can potentially help pets and maybe even people in the future. And so I think that's a driving force, I think, that is behind a lot of enrollment in our clinical trials.
That was a good sell spoken from the director of clinical trials. Great, concise, three wonderful points. And I wanted to go back and correct myself because I kind of jumbled a very large concept. I didn't mean to imply that clinical trials are risk-free at all, and that we know that there are adverse events. So, so what percentage, I want to talk about adverse events and outcomes, and that's kind of the cost benefit of clinical trials, right? The outcome or potential outcome versus the risk of an adverse event. So what would you say? And I know everything I say, I know is an oversimplification because there are probably greater risk on a phase 1 than there is a phase 2. Again, I'm generalizing. So what would you say if the average pet parent asked you or said, hey, Dr. Weishaar, I'd like to enroll my dog in an osteosarc study. What's the percentage? Just give me an idea. What's the possibility of an adverse event? Do you know what that is?
It's a really great question, and it's an important question for owners to know. But it's really variable depending on the study and, the phase of the study and the drugs that we're testing or the device that we're testing and sort of what's involved. And so, we go through what all the potential known side effects of a drug are. We talk about, there are studies where we're getting tumor biopsies. And so we talk about risks of tumor biopsies and, it is oncology. And so the drugs that we're using are toxic. And that's just, that comes with the territory. Even the drugs that we use in the clinic that are approved, that we use every day in pets with cancer, there's a risk of toxicity. And we have a better sense of the risk of toxicity in those drugs just because we've been using them for so long and have so much more experience with them. So we can say, there is, in general, about this % of dogs will have side effects, and these are what the side effects are. But with these, drugs that we're just getting to know and just really starting to learn about using in pets, it may be a bit unknown. And there's always differences in tolerability. So there's going to be some pets that will tolerate a drug really well, and then pets that receive the same dose and have the same disease and then don't tolerate it at all. It's the same in people, it's really quite variable. We do whatever we can to minimize that toxicity. So if we're giving a drug and we're seeing really significant side effects, we'll stop it, we'll adjust doses, we'll adjust frequencies, whatever we need to do. And that's the same in clinical trials. Just because we started a dose doesn't mean that we have to stay there.
So on Facebook, I said I'm part of a lot of cancer groups. And a lot of the pet parents will say, well, my dog was on XYZ chemo and they didn't tolerate it, so we took it off, took the dog off of it. So I know there's an optimal dosage, but even if you backed off of it a little bit, would it still be beneficial to the dog to have them on there? I know with Lily, my dog Lily, that had stomach cancer, I guess the optimal dose of Palladia that she was on really caused her to, it upset her stomach. So we backed off of it just a little bit, and then she tolerated it for a year.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, and again, that's very drug dependent, but, there are some pets that just really do not tolerate these drugs at all and don't tolerate them well. And, our goals in veterinary oncology are so different than in human oncology, where quality of life is really, really the number one thing. And so, we'll do dose adjustments, decreasing doses, decreasing frequency, but it gets to a point where if we're getting to a dose that's so low and the pet is still not tolerating it, then it's probably not going to be all that beneficial for the pet, because as we decrease doses, we do lose some efficacy, depending a little bit on the drug. There have been some studies, you mentioned Palladia specifically, the label dose for Palladia is quite a bit higher than what we normally start with in the clinic. And there's data to show that even going quite a bit lower on that dose, there can be still some effectiveness. So depends a little bit on the drugs. With some of our chemotherapy drugs, even small decreases in doses can make a big difference in efficacy. So sort of balancing that. So, trying to balance keeping the dose as high as we possibly can, while actually, maintaining the quality of life of that.
I guess the good thing is that you have the typical pet parent that comes to you says, "Doc, I'd do anything. Let's try anything." Their cancer's probably typically in an advanced state, and the other traditional, maybe gold standard treatments aren't working or something, or they just want an adjunct or want to just try something where the potential outcome is better. So you have that, they're willing to assume risk. Their risk tolerance is much higher. And that's a hard thing to say, because you're talking about a loved one. You're talking about their companion, their mate. And as you know, it's not always easy to measure pain and discomfort in our Fuzzybutts. So, in making medical decisions on behalf of any living thing, spirit, is just it's a huge onus. It's a big responsibility. But I want to go back to what you said earlier. It's important. We are dealing with cancer. Cancer is an unknown. It's a known quantity, but there's still a great deal of uncertainty. It can do very unpredictable things. It can zig whenever we think it's gonna zag. And at the end of the day, the pet parent has to make the toughest decision, which I made for Murphy, and I want to go back to it. If I can do it without crying, because I chose to do do a follow-on dose of chemo at Texas A&M, and like within 24 hours, Murphy's red blood cell count or white blood cell count just bottomed out, and he was in the ICU for the next couple of days. And he was already immunocompromised. So I still have nightmares about that. I still yell at myself in my mind. I still have a great deal of regret and pain that I carry with me. So I kind of wanted to talk about, for you, and talk with you about, that's the typical situation that you're dealing with, is you have a pet parent that's willing to do anything, and it's a huge dynamic and it's a huge responsibility. So on that note, Dr. Weishaar, what if you had to ballpark it again? The reason why I prefaced my previous question with, I know these are generalizations. We're talking about clinical trials that cover a whole host of different types of cancers and different types of treatments and so on and so forth. But if you had to think about in terms of positive outcomes, what percentage of the clinical trials that you see there at CSU have the intended outcome that they reach the objective, if you had to ballpark that?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to say that I'm very sorry that you feel that way about what happened with Murphy. That's got to be a lot for you to carry, and that's really tough. I want you to know that he had cancer. There was no right or wrong decision for what you could have chosen to do. And I hope that's something that you can you can understand. You know, he had a terminal disease and there was nothing that you could have done different to make it any better.
I'm one of those old, fortunately, I was on one of those old school Texans where I just keep everything inside and keep that in me. And it is motivated. The good thing is we all have loss and grief and we go through that, and it's a tough thing that's unique to everyone. But we hope at the end of it that we can transform it into something that's beneficial and productive and useful for all of us. So I always hope that somehow Murphy's data could get out there again, the importance of an N of one.
Yeah.
But as you know, clinical trials or putting together trials, it's a costly, difficult process, and it takes quite a bit of time. So that's a good segue to what is the typical cost per patient there for you guys per patient? Is it
Well,
like?
I didn't want to not answer your other question about the success rate. Success rate of.
Oh yes, I'm having a tough time. I'm getting a little choked up here talking about Murphy, and I
Yep.
talked about it a little too much. And I do appreciate you saying. I do appreciate you saying that. It is very important for everyone to realize that you are dealing with cancer, and his was pretty much terminal from the start. And I just but when you make the I just carry things far too long. But it's a reminder to me that and I should be a reminder to everyone. And I think people feel the same way or similar. They just don't carry it the same way I do, is that you're making medical decisions on behalf of another beautiful soul. And that's the number one responsibility, whether it's a child or it's an elderly patient. My mom had Alzheimer's. My dad had to make a whole host of medical decisions on her behalf. That's just a huge responsibility. So let's get now to the outcome. I'm interested in that. Please go ahead.
Yes. So, you know what I would say to sort of generalize things a little bit is that we learn something from every clinical trial that we do, and whether that's, you know, we reach the outcome that we were expecting, you know, generally, you know, we have some sort of hypothesis or idea of what is going to be the outcome of the clinical trial. And while we may not be correct in that hypothesis, we learn something. So we learn that the combination of drugs that we're using is not better than what we normally use, and maybe has more side effects or has unique side effects that we weren't necessarily expecting. Or we may find that, wow, this really does actually work really great and is another option for pet parents. And sometimes it's, you know, like we have a treatment that we're using pretty commonly, but we don't really know, you know, we have some sort of anecdotal data, and based on, you know, what we've seen in the pets that we've treated, we feel like it has a benefit, but we can't really say specifically, you know, how beneficial that is, what percent of patients are going to respond. And so that's why doing that type of research is really important. And just to touch on, I know one of the talking points you had mentioned was retrospective versus prospective studies. And that is, you know, that's really the crux of doing these types of clinical trials, is that, you know, retrospective data and, you know, the majority of the research that's out there in veterinary medicine and veterinary oncology, unfortunately, is retrospective data, which means, you know, looking back at patients that have previously been treated, collecting information from their medical records, and making some sort of conclusions based on those data. And it's really important to have that information. And for some, you know, diseases where it's really uncommon, that's really going to be the best way to do it, because you're just not going to be able to enroll as many patients, you know, into a clinical trial in a reasonable amount of time to be able to get that information. So sometimes retrospective data are really all that we have. But there are limitations that come with that. You know, you're looking at medical records, which may or may not be 100% complete or accurate. You're sort of extrapolating data from that and not sort of getting the real experience and not collecting things in real time. So with prospective studies, you know, we're intentionally treating these pets in a certain way. We're collecting the data as it happens. We're able to document all the side effects, document any changes that are seen, document responses more accurately, and sort of have, you know, a better quality of the data and more complete data. And so that is one of the benefits of having these clinical trials, for sure.
Yes. Going back to Murphy, you know, I was speaking as a dad and the tough decisions, but as the um, the person that I guess the amateur that understands the importance of clinical trials and science, all data is important data. We didn't get the outcome that we wanted, and perhaps that was impossible to achieve. Any good outcome was impossible to achieve, but that's still good data. That's important data that goes into this corpus of knowledge that we all that benefits all pet parents. The altruistic thing that you were speaking about earlier. The problem with that, though, like you were saying, is retrospective studies. The problem with it is if we're all using the number, I think we're all using the number of 6 million new cases of cancer in dogs every year. So we have so many new cases of cancer to be looked at that are currently spontaneously occurring right now that are ongoing. It's like, oh, well, we got to now set aside some resources to go back and look at data, historical data. And as you know, I'm sure you know all too well, is there's already a paucity of funds available to fund clinical trials in veterinary oncology. And we're not even a rounding error to human oncology, unfortunately. But the great news is that the scientific community is adopting comparative oncology, comparative science, and the one cancer model. So that's the good news. So that was a lot to chew off right there, but I just wanted to emphasize that it is the way to look at it is the healthy way to look at it is that we can't always get the outcome that we want, but it's still important to get that data. But as you know, clinical trials research cost money, and that's why I was just curious. I think when I talked to Dr. Bergman at BCA, he runs clinical trials for all of BCA, and I think the number that he gave me was maybe 10 to 15,000, I think, per enrollee. And again, that varies depending on what phase. Going back to that, but what kind of cost are you looking at CSU?
Yeah, and yeah, like you said, it's really going to vary depending on the study that we're doing, and like you said, funding is limited, and sometimes a lot of our studies that we do are investigator initiated, meaning that it's one of our investigators, one of our doctors, our researchers has come up with an idea, wants to do a clinical trial, applies for a grant to get some funding, and sort of, gets whatever funding they're allocated and has to do the best that they can with that funding, versus some clinical trials which are industry sponsored, where a pharmaceutical company might come to us and say, hey, we want to try this drug in pets with cancer, can you help us? And those tend to have a much better funding and more funds available. So I would say, for your average phase 1 clinical trial, where it's a small number of pets, they're often on the study for a short amount of time, those may be able to get by with around 30 to 50,000, depending on exactly what you're doing in the test that you're doing to get all those patients done. But once you're getting into, like I mentioned, the phase 3 randomized clinical trials that are enrolling a large number of patients, those are getting into the hundreds of thousands and maybe even millions of dollars. And so it's really important to be able to have that funding available to get those studies done. And, that's one of the big problems is, you have this research that you want to do, and if you don't have the funding to be able to enroll the number of pets that you need and to do all the testing that you need to do, then you can miss out on a lot of that information that you're trying to gain.
We just had Dr. Kelly Deal with Morris Animal Foundation on to talk about their absolutely fantastic lifetime golden retriever lifetime study. I think golden retriever lifetime study. Yes. And I can't recall, Ginger, what the current tab is, over $25 million, but that's 3,000 patients studying for. It's a long longitudinal study over a very large population. It's what needs to be done. But when after I lost Malcolm, my first dog to osteosarc, and I got on the road and started walking, I very early really realized, after talking to hundreds of pet parents, that what they wanted to know were risk factors. It's great to have novel therapies. That's very important. It's extremely important, because if you can get it, for a dog, adding 3 months to a prognosis is tremendous. 3 to 6 months is wonderful. If we can get that additional time. But I realize that such a study with a high population over a long period of time is very expensive, and there's just not the funds out there to, as you know, to out there, the NIH, the NCI, which is part of the NIH, just finally said it. Finally, after all this time, set aside 20 million for comparative oncology research, and everyone was clapping their hands. And I'm like, I'm not a glass half empty guy. I'm like, we need a new glass. We need something. We need different metrics. But I've learned since I've been doing this 15 years, Dr. Weishaar, since I lost Malcolm and I started on my journey, and I thought we'd be much further along, all of us as a community. All of us, we've all worked so hard collectively, but that it was just it's been a huge heartbreak that it's just not, there's still so many studies that need to be done. There's so many important questions that we have that we need to ask, and it just can't happen fast enough, and we just can't seem to get the money fast enough. So I apologize for preaching. This is a very passionate subject of mine because I've been doing this as an amateur, of course, and an outsider. I'm not a scientist. I'm certainly not a veterinary oncologist. So, but by virtue of the foundation, I've just been thinking about cancer, veterinary oncology research for a long time. One of the other issues pet parents have, and I think that we have, and it's an important question, and we've had this with our foundation and the studies that we've funded as well, is speaking of outcomes, is what happens to that data? How do we get that out to the public so they can consume it? And whether, like you said, I loved how you talked about, maybe all data is good data, and sometimes a bad outcome gives us important data that's then a platform to go on and do other things. So I'm a big fan of get all the data out to pet parents as possible, make everything as transparent as possible. And I know some of it's going to be extremely technical, but that's why in every episode, I always say, go see a board certified veterinary oncologist. They'll help you navigate through the waters. Most nearly all of them I know are extremely well read and current with everything. So I'm belaboring a point, but I know that but sometimes in the frustration we've had with the foundation is you can't always demand that the PI, the principal investigator, publish. It's not something that's sometimes completely out of their control. So what percentage of the trials that aren't private, I know some are proprietary and private, I would imagine, what percentage are published, or does the data actually get out to pet parents?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Some of the things that we do are not necessarily meant to be published, right. So like phase 1 studies those are to be used towards a future study. And so having that data out there isn't really going to help anybody. And that usually is published sort of as part of a later study that's done looking more at efficacy. I would say, it's a small number, unfortunately, a small percentage that actually get published. And I think part of that is because, there's a lot of data that is accrued. And so having the time and the resources to be able to go through all of those data and collaborate everything and get it actually into a paper and get it published. It's not easy. It's not cheap. And so, funding, I think, is another thing. But I do think it's really important to get that information out there. And so, one of the things that I personally do is whenever we have a clinical trial where the paper is published, I will send that paper to the pet parents of any pets that participated in that study. And I'll just do like a brief synopsis. Like, I don't understand, I don't expect them to understand all the nuances of what's in there, but I will just write a quick blurb that says, hey, these are the main findings of the study. We really appreciate your participation in it. And just so they have that. And that, sometimes this happens, 5 or 10 years after their pet was enrolled in the study. But hopefully that gives them some sort of sense that, they contributed to something bigger. And I think that's really important. And as you mentioned, it's really important to publish the negative data, which doesn't always make it out there. And that's because, if there's an oncologist somewhere around the world that's using this treatment protocol and we've found that it's actually really not that beneficial, it's important for them to know. And if that doesn't get published, there's no way for them to know that.
One of Elon Musk's mantras, his main operating models is fail as quickly as possible, and that's a bit different in the rocketry world. Maybe not entirely different in the automobile world, but it is that's look. We need to be able to get the outcome that we want, that we think is possible. So however many iterations we can go through as quickly as possible is the best path. And that's a new way of thinking about that. Do you also publish on all the clinical trials that you can that are proprietary? Do you publish them in like a CSU Flint Animal Cancer Center newsletter? Do you at least publish them?
Um, for ones that aren't actually published in journals,
Correct.
is that what you're referring to?
Exactly. Put them out there and for public consumption in some capacity, whether on your website in a PDF, like a white paper or something.
Generally not. And I think, part of that is, having a paper that's peer reviewed and published in the literature is going to have a lot more, sort of clout and being able to be interpreted better. If everybody just put out the research that they did and made these claims, depending on how the trial is conducted and the data is collected and how you report things can be skewed, depending on the results that if it's not a peer-reviewed paper, you can sort of report the positive things and not the negative things. And so that can be a little bit misconstrued. I'm not saying for us, but, just sort of in general reporting data. So not in any specific way, we'll kind of, when we reach out to the CSU local community, we'll talk about the studies that we have going on and sort of what research that we're doing, but we don't want to, provide any sort of undue influence that, may change how people practice or their thoughts about different things without actually having that sort of peer-reviewed publication to go along with it.
Yeah, I understand the value and the importance of having something peer reviewed, because quality of data is just as important, if not more important, than quantity of data. And in fact, actually, in some cases, quality of data is infinitely more important than quantity of data. Well, I'm trying to ask as many questions as I can from the pet parent perspective.
Sure.
I know you do a wonderful job there. You're doing some wonderful research, but I kind of want to talk about move towards something more exciting and interesting. So, can you talk about some really cool research that's currently underway there at CSU? Something that you're seeing that's exciting you guys that you could kind of whet our appetite to look forward to?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things I think that we're doing that is really exciting and I think has a great potential for benefit for both pets and people with cancer is treatment for osteosarcoma, specifically bone cancer, and for osteosarcoma that has spread to the lungs. So, as you're well aware, osteosarcoma is a very common cancer that we see in dogs. It occurs in people as well, generally adolescents or kids. Not nearly as common, though. It's actually a pretty rare cancer in people. But the cancer that we see in dogs is exactly the same as what we see in people. It occurs in the same locations. It looks the same on x-rays. It looks the same under the microscope, responds to the same treatments. And so therefore, as I mentioned before, the things that we can learn from our pets with cancer can potentially be translated to people with cancer. And that's exactly what's happened here. So some of our researchers were looking specifically for a drug that would affect some cells that are present, not necessarily in the tumor, but in the environment where the tumor lives. So what's called the tumor microenvironment. So there's a number of different cells and different things that live in the environment around the tumor. And those are necessary to help the tumor grow and to spread and really to promote tumor survival. And so if we can target that tumor microenvironment and suppress that may be something that can actually affect the tumor itself without targeting the tumor cells themselves. And so there's a population of cells specifically in tumors of osteosarcoma that are spread to the lungs called macrophages, which are inflammatory cells that contribute to the spread and progression of this type of cancer. And so some of our researchers were doing a screen in the lab rather than trying to make a drug that would target these tumor-associated macrophages, seeing if there was a drug already out there that could be repurposed to target these specific cells. And so they were looking at a number of different drugs, and they actually found a drug that could target these macrophages, and it's a drug called losartan. So you may have heard of this. It's a drug that's used to treat high blood pressure, both in people as well as in animals. It belongs to a class of drugs called angiotensin receptor blockers. But what they found is that this drug could actually impact these tumor-associated macrophages in the lab, so looking at it in a petri dish. And so they wanted to test this in pets with cancer to see if it could have a benefit, and used it in combination with a drug that you're all familiar with, Palladia, not necessarily because of the targeting effects that Palladia has on receptor tyrosine kinases, but because of the immunomodulatory effects that Palladia can have as well. So they took this drug combination of Palladia and losartan and did some clinical trials looking at it in dogs with osteosarcoma that had spread to their lungs. And what they actually found was a really positive outcome in that about 25% of the dogs enrolled had their tumors get smaller, and another 25% had their lung tumors stay stable for a long period of time. So once this cancer spreads to the lungs in people and in dogs, there are really no great treatment options, and it tends to progress really quickly. So having a drug combination that could shrink these tumors or potentially just keep them stable for a long period of time is considered a win. So we were really excited about what we had seen. And these are drugs that are commercially available. They're not experimental drugs. They have a known toxicity profile, known dosing, so really easy to use. And so because of the research that we did here and the success that we saw in these dogs with metastatic osteosarcoma, there are actually clinical trials open now at Children's Hospital in Denver and in Atlanta looking at this drug combination for kids with metastatic osteosarcoma.
This is really exciting. With the Puppy Up Foundation, we always have a human hero and a canine hero for all of our walks. Last year, our human hero was actually a patient at St. Jude who had osteosarcoma. Now he's been, he gets checked every 3 or 4 months and everything right now is clear. But I know that his grandmother, Peggy, who works with me, and his parents that's one of the things that they're afraid of, that it might spread.
For sure.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I just want to say we've had bone cancer. So that's a very relevant, very important, and very personal to us because the first dog I lost, Malcolm, was bone cancer. And then one of our own, Peggy, who's worked for our foundation, been a part of the Puppy Up Foundation for a long time. What is the grandson has bone cancer. How old is he again?
He's 12. I think he's going to be 13 in August. So.
And like you said, it's rare, but wow. So, and obviously, like you were saying, is metastasis is the key concern. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you, but wanted to let you know how personal of an issue it is for us.
Cancer is something that has touched all of us. And, with how common, we see probably, 1 to 2 or more new cases of bone cancer in dogs coming in through the clinic every week. And so, it's something that we see all the time. We know it's a really aggressive cancer. We do the best that we can, but, generally once it gets to the point where it's spread to the lungs, there's not a whole lot of good treatment options. And so to have something that can provide at least a little bit of hope to these pet parents and potentially, humans is really exciting.
Where does this study go from here?
So we're looking at, in dogs specifically, we're looking at those 2 drugs, Palladia and losartan, and looking at adding a 3rd drug to it to see if there's a benefit beyond what we're seeing with the Palladia and losartan. So there's a number of different drugs that we've tried in combination, and we actually there's an ongoing clinical trial at CSU and also in collaboration with Tufts University, looking at this 3-drug combination actually to try to prevent metastasis. So putting the dogs on these drugs before they get their legs amputated, having their amputation, and keeping them on these drugs long term to see if we can try to do better than we do with the chemotherapy. And so that's a really great clinical trial that's going on right now. The study in kids is it's a slower study. Like, it's a pretty uncommon cancer, like I said, so it's a little bit tougher to recruit to. And what they're doing right now is some dose escalation of the losartan. So the dose of losartan that we're using in the dogs with cancer is actually 10 times the label dose. But we've found that it's actually really well tolerated in dogs. Unfortunately, regulations are a little bit tighter in human medicine, and you can't just start a kid on a drug at 10 times the dose that you need. And so they have to sort of slowly escalate that dose. And so they are, I believe, I don't know about enrollment in Atlanta, but in Denver, they've enrolled 5 kids. So 3 in the first dose cohort and then working on the second dose.
So that's human patients, pediatric patients with no evidence of metastasis. Is that correct?
They have metastasis.
They have metastasis. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, that's very, very important research that you're doing there. I have a ton more questions. We're running a little bit long. Is there anything that you can think of right now, Dr. Weishaar, that I have forgotten or we've left out sort of on our end that you wanted to talk about?
Nothing specific. I think it's just really important to get the word out there that these clinical trials exist, and for pet parents to be advocates for themselves. And so, a lot of times they may not know that a clinical trial may be an option. And so, asking their veterinarians, asking their veterinary oncologists, not every veterinary oncologist does clinical trials. And so may need to go to somewhere like an academic institution or a specialty private practice that does clinical trials, and just, being an advocate for themselves and for their pets so they can know all the options that are out there and make the best decision for them and their pet.
So if they were going to look for a clinical trial, like if my dog is diagnosed with some cancer, is there a place where I can just go and look to see if there are clinical trials that might be
pertinent? Wouldn't that be great? So yeah, in human medicine, there's clinicaltrials.gov, which you're probably aware of, which it's actually required that every clinical trial that is being conducted be registered on that clinical trial. So that is a comprehensive database of all clinical trials. You can go in there, you can search for whatever it is you're looking for, and it will tell you all the clinical trials in the country that are going on for that specific condition and locations and everything. Unfortunately, we don't have anything like that in veterinary medicine. The closest thing we have, the AVMA has an online searchable clinical trials database. It's called the Animal Health Studies Database, I believe, and that's not just for oncology, that's for clinical trials for any condition. And it's in the United States and Canada, so you can go in and punch in whatever disease you're looking for, and it will pull up clinical trials. The problem with that is that it's not mandated, and so it's required, whoever is conducting the clinical trial, whatever institution, has to physically go in there and enter the clinical trials. And so all of our clinical trials are in there, the oncology trials, but it's not going to be comprehensive. Another option would be, looking at the websites for any veterinary academic institutions that are nearby. So, depending on your location, usually you can find, if they have clinical trials going on, those are going to be listed on their website. And there's people you can reach out to there. And they potentially may know about clinical trials going on at other places if they don't have anything.
Excellent. That was the perfect segue to wrap up things. I did have one more, and there are a couple of things that we're not going to have time to get to. But I'm quite certain we're going to have you on again to talk about whatever. We'll find something to talk about. Interesting. And by the way, this platform's always available to you if you have a trial that you're signing up patients for, you want to get the word out, even if it's just a 15-minute to 10-minute, whatever, we'll get it out to our people. That's what our job is here at Fuzzybutts and Friends. We do that at no charge to anyone for that. But I'm a huge, I spent a lot of my time, Dr. Weishaar, thinking about AI and how it can transform veterinary oncology. So are you guys there at CSU? Are you looking at maybe, because I believe AI will streamline the drug discovery and development process, reduce substantially the cost of clinical trials, and hopefully potentially remove the need for any experimentation on animals of any type. So are you guys looking at, or any AI projects on your plate right now?
Nothing specifically in the clinical setting. I do believe there is some work they're doing in some of the laboratories here at CSU that does use some AI. I'm not sure of the specific exactly what they're using it for, but I do believe there is some work going on there, but nothing that I can speak to specifically. But, I agree. I think it's a really untapped resource and something that we potentially could be looking to in the future.
It'll happen very fast. Everything and since Chat GPT, we're at GPT-4 now, it's just all unraveling very, very quickly, and it has the potential to transform. So I'm a big fan of it, big advocate of that. And actually, we're looking at some projects here within the foundation. All right, Dr. Weishaar, can you give us the address or where they can look for clinical trials there at the Flint Animal Cancer Center?
Yeah, so the CSU website is csuanimalcancercenter.org. I believe that's correct. You can also just Google Flint Animal Cancer Center at Colorado State University. All of our clinical trials are listed on that website with brief information. We also have an online consult service. So if your pet has been diagnosed with cancer, whether you're interested in a clinical trial or not, you're able to submit a request to speak with a specialist. We can give you information. Can't talk about your specific pet, but we can give you information about, the disease and treatment options, and potentially including clinical trials. There's no cost for that service, and so that's on the website as well.
Wonderful. And also, you guys have a wonderful newsletter that I get, so you can sign up for there as well. All right, we've reached the time of the show then. Ginger, we typically do a cancer tip for the Puppy Up Foundation, but we've been talking about cancer for some time. So anything, did I miss anything? Did I screw up anything? Or are there any last words that you'd like to share with our audience?
The only thing I would like to just repeat is look for those clinical trials. Ask your veterinarian, research, go to CSU and I guess all the other teaching universities for veterinary schools, and just ask people.
That's a great point, Ginger. Actually, you should be seeing a board. So you should definitely always have the initial consultation with the veterinary oncologist, a board certified veterinary oncologist. And that's the question that you should ask them, is that, can you get me access to that? And so that's something you can do. It's a great point. Can you find out where clinical trials, and they should be able to, if you're having a hard time finding that information as well. Do you have patient sign up enrollees from outside of the Fort Collins area?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have owners come from all over the state. It's generally need to be within a reasonable driving time, because there are regular visits that are required for studies, and it's important that they come in for those specific visits. But we've had dedicated clients that have driven 6 hours every week for their pets to be enrolled in a clinical trial. And so, like I said, that's why we tell them up front, make sure they know what they're in for, and they can make that decision if that's something that they're able to do.
The things that we do for our Fuzzybutts, drive hours and hours, days and days and days.
Exactly.
You get that. All right. I'd like to thank Dr. Kristen Weishaar. That's my homage to Sean Khanna, a good friend of both of ours. That's my homage to him. Shout out to him. No, her name is Dr. Weishaar, Dr. Kristen Weishaar with CSU. Thank you so much for being back on Fuzzybutts and Friends. And again, you're always welcome to come back to talk about anything you're excited to share with our audience, or that's relevant to the pet parents of Fuzzybutts all out there. So, all right, everybody, that wraps up this episode of Fuzzybutts and Friends. We'll see you next time. You can check us out on your podcast platforms such as Spotify and iHeartRadio, or you can watch us live on the video on our YouTube channel. It's at fuzzybuttsstudios.com. Till next time, puppy up. Talk soon.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.